Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to call the meeting to order and acknowledge that we're in Treaty 1 territory, the home and traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Ojibwe, Innu, Cree, and Dakota peoples, and in the national homeland of the Red River Métis. Our drinking water comes from Shoal Lake 40 First Nation in Treaty 3 territory. My name is Lynn Nesbitt, and I'll be chairing this morning's panel. Joining me on the panel also via Zoom is Kent Seelan and Cynthia Stevens. Our administrative personnel today is Zachary Mohan, and our assessor is Jonathan Spacek. We will be hearing applications for revision of the assessment roll in accordance with the Municipal Assessment Act. The matters for which revision is requested have been described in each application, and we will limit discussion to those matters. The statements that are made at this hearing are sworn testimony, and anyone speaking to the matters must be sworn in. Be advised that comparisons of assessments of properties are not considered evidence of market value by the Board of Revision. The Board of Revision is appointed annually by Council and is independent of it and the City Administration. It makes its decisions on the basis of the evidence provided at this hearing and issues a written order that will be mailed to all parties as soon as possible. Please note that the Board's decisions with respect to an application may be appealed to the Manitoba Municipal Board if the matter pertains to assessed value or classification, or to the Court of King's Bench if the matter pertains to the application of exemptions from taxation. Should you wish to appeal, information on how to do so will be included with the Board's order. With respect to the hearing process, I will confirm the points of appeal with your property to be addressed with each applicant following the swearing in. We will then have the assessor's testimony followed by questions that the applicant may have, and then the applicant's testimony followed by questions. Each side will have an opportunity to summarize if they wish. Once all of the evidence about an application has been brought forward, the applicant may leave. The process will repeat for each item on the docket today. The session will close after all applications have been heard, and the Board will deliberate in private and make its decisions. You will receive the Board's decision by registered mail as soon as possible. As information, all public hearings are live streamed, recorded, and will be part of the public record. We will be hearing item 4 on our docket today. Mr. Mohan, please affirm the assessor's and applicant's testimony.
Of course, Madam Chair. Please state your full name.
Jonathan Spacek.
Do you affirm that the evidence you're about to give this hearing is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do, yes.
Thank you. You may be seated. Mr. Applicant, please state your full name.
Rod Slaughter.
Do you affirm that the evidence you're about to give this hearing is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes, I do.
Thank you. You may be seated.
Thank you very much, and good morning, Mr. Spacek and Mr. Slaughter. We just have the one item on our docket today, 220 Portage Avenue. Are there any preliminary issues that should be raised before we start?
No.
Okay, then Mr. Spacek, you may begin with your evidence on item number 4. That is file number 24-1681, 220 Portage, please.
Thank you very much. We are looking at file number 24-1681. We have a roll number 12093015100. Address is 220 Portage Avenue. This is the large office building at the corner of Portage and Fort. If you turn to page 2, you'll be able to see an aerial photo and street view of the property. Has the Royal Bank on the main floor in the basement. You will see we have a 2025 value of $26,629,000. Again, we have a 17-story office building built in 1965 due to some upgrades across the building in 2017 mainly. We have an effective year of 1985 on this property. We have a total gross area of 226,925 square feet and a leasable area of 173,210 square feet. Again, if you turn to page 2, you'll just see where this property is located, just west of Portage in Maine. Page 2 shows you a better idea of how it looks from the street view if you're not familiar with the property. If we turn to page 3, we'll see that they've always complied with our request for information. We received a mailer for 2022, and I've also included some historical sales, but they go back to 2013 as the most recent. For subject property leases, I've included a portion of my second piece of evidence. What I've included, if you have that file as well, it's called the OFB Marketplace Study. I will go over that shortly, but I have included the portion of that just shows our the stabilized rents, vacancy, some of the information for the property from 2022. So you'll see from 2022, from 2015 to 2022, sorry. So at the bottom of page 3, you can see some of that information, such as the average rent stabilized at $17.67 for the property. But just there to quickly reference, if you need, I'll go over it more in detail later. If we turn to page 4, we have an income workup for the property. So you'll see how this building is valued. We use the income approach for 2025 for these OFB office buildings. You'll see a large amount of premises across this, 173,210 10,000 square feet. This is, I've put a blended rent. So you can look at it as across this whole building, each square foot leases or it can be rented for $14.58. Our OFBs, the cycle, have a vacancy loss of 12%, expenses of 3%. And if you turn to page 5, you'll see we have shortfall at $14 a square foot for the vacant space in the property, and an overall capitalization rate of 7% for all of our OFBs. This is a total value of $26,629,000. If you turn to page 6, again, I've put a portion of our OFB study from the PDF, but this is a rent comparable study. So what you see here is an overview of all what we consider market rents in the OFB portfolio for 2015 to 2022. So you can see the first line is actually the average rent for each year across all units in OFBs. And if you go to the end, you can see on the right hand side under stabilized, all these values are stabilized from 2020 to 2022. So there's been a 3-year stabilization done to see how the rents look over the last 3 years. And you can see the 3-year average across OFBs is approximately $15.44. The weighted average is $14.96. If you look at the third line on the right hand side under stabilized, the median is $15. And if you go down to the vacancy row, you'll see a vacancy of OFBs stabilized at 17.9%. The vacancy weighted average 18.8%, and the vacancy median at 14.4%. And then again, there's some more information on the size of units leased and how much information is used for this. We also have a shortfall average of $14.10, and then a non-recoverable average of 2.3%. Again, this is in the OFB study I've included as well, which we'll go over quickly, but bottom of page 6 just shows the standard deviation for rents used. So you can see along the bell curve where some of these rents lie. Are they anomalies at the end, or are they closer to the center? Where again, our actual average is 1544, which will be showing up at the center of the bell curve. Everyone can turn to page 8. We have our standard capitalization rate sheet. You will notice on the sheet we do have downtown B OFBs. So if you look at the third row from the top, under property type, downtown B, we have OFB. Under City of Winnipeg PTC, that's our property type class for this property. You will see that there is a 20th and 80th percentile shown for the City of Winnipeg, but since all of our OFBs, the cycle, are at 7%, you'll see the range is very tight at 7% there. Colliers is reporting the range for OFBs downtown to be 6.25 to 7%. So for this range, we are on the high end at 7%. We have CBRE reporting 7 to 8% for OFBs. Again, we're on the low of their range at 7%. And finally, the last column, the last 2 columns are showing Cushman and Wakefield. They're at 7.5 to 8.5. So we were below their low for what Cushman and Wakefield is reporting for OFBs in 2023, or I should say Q1 2023. So again, the capitalization rate seems fair. I've also included on page 10 to page 23 is the actual mailer for the property, so you can see the actual rental income. Again, we have actual expenses reported, and we have all of the tenants on the rent roll, again, which is summarized in our OFB marketplace study. But if you have any questions on any singular tenants, you can take a look on those pages. And you will notice on page 23, if you took this as a kind of a summary of the property and the financials, but you will notice that the total area being reported in 2023, which is different from our model of 173,000, is they're reporting a total area of 169,728. So as is with some of these large properties, the leasable space does change based on renovations and how they tenant out areas. And again, I'm not in disagreement of 169,728 square feet. It is sometimes a moving target, but I would be comfortable adjusting to that square footage. Also, if we turn to page 24, I've just tried to include some extra information for the building. So on page 24, I've included some of the upgrades that have been completed in this building. So you can see in 2017, it went through some major renovations. These include LED base building light systems. HVAC is known for the ultimate in tenant comfort. They've also modernized their elevators. They've modernized their washrooms. They've actually been able to be considered LEED Platinum EV certification for the building, which there's not too many in Winnipeg. They've included exterior LED lighting and updated their ceiling systems. And just in page 25, I included some more pictures that are included in some of the leasing booklets for the property, but you can see pictures of the property. And page 26, I've just included a map showing its relative location to other major buildings in the downtown. And page 27, you can see some more pictures just to show the quality of the property. And just quickly, I'm not sure who has seen the OFB study this cycle, who has had, but I will just quickly, I'll give everybody a chance to make sure everybody has a copy of our, I don't know what the file number is, but it's called the OFB Marketplace 2015. It's a black PDF with the black background.
Zach, do we have that?
So admittedly, that was a minor oversight on my part. I just uploaded it though, so it is in the SharePoint.
Yeah, that's no problem.
Okay, thank you.
Let's open it up.
Just let us get to it then. Okay, does everybody else have it?
Just give me a second.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've got it. Thank you.
Mr. Seelan?
Sorry, not yet. Let me try again. Yes, thanks.
Okay. Okay, Mr. Spacek?
Okay, thank you very much. So this is an OFB marketplace study. So this is done to help us as an area better understand how these buildings are performing year to year. It helps us, make sure that our model is, is it in line with how these buildings are actually performing? And again, our assessor, Mr. Pohl, has put together a great reference here. So if you turn to page 2, he's actually included a summary for everything. I will just go over, I'll just read you out the summary. I'll say from reading the whole piece and just go over it after that. But just for your understanding, the OFB Marketplace Study's main purpose is to ensure fair and equitable assessments for the OFB property type class. This study is also being used for appeal defense purposes at the Board Revision for the 2025 reassessment. This study is sourced from an 8-year review of every OFB property that operated on a net rent basis. The study encompasses 17 OFB properties, 557 commercial rentable units, and over 3.2 million square feet of leasable inventory. The study examines individual OFB properties and the Winnipeg marketplace as a whole and cross-references its findings against outside sources in terms of owner advertised leasing activities. All parameters in the study are isolated to individual years and are in relation to each other to ensure a proper and accurate year-by-year analysis of the Winnipeg OFB marketplace for assessment purposes. The study yields the best and most comprehensive market evidence to determine assessments on a fee simple basis. So again, it does go through explaining each of the parameters that are analyzed, all the ones in our income approach. I will just show you some of the important ones that, again, I've included what I believe to be important in my brief, some of the snapshots. But again, if just in case you need to review these more, where I got my snapshot for the actual net rents, you'll see for the comparables is on page 4. And I've already went over that in the brief, but I just wanted to show you for what you can see as the comparables, where that is driven from. Is if you look at the bottom or halfway through page 5, it shows OFB marketplace study analysis. And then each building on the left-hand side is an OFB. So you'll see 330 St. Mary's, 240 Graham. And as you turn the pages, you'll go through each OFB has been analyzed over 8 years. There's a 3-year running stabilized rent, vacancy, number of units being leased, shortfall, and the non-recoverable. So there's a large amount of information put down here, but again, what I'm showing you in my brief on the rent comparables is all of those rents, what is the actual rent, and then what I've included under our subject leases is this building's actually analyzed. So if you turn to page 6 and you see the second building under 4 St. Mary's, there's 220 Portage. So the property we're looking at today has been analyzed over 8 years. And again, just to show you under the average rent for the property, in 2022, it was actually garnering approximately $17.94 a square foot. Our model for this property is at $14.58. So we are under what is actual being reported on net rents for this property. You'll see the vacancy for 2020 Portage for 2022 is 24.7%. And you can even go back and look at all the years. It's been at 21.4% and 29.2% in 2020. But the stabilized over the last 3 years is 21.3%. Our market vacancy for OFBs is at 12%. And shortfall, you'll see the properties reporting a shortfall of 17.54. And then for a 3-year average, 17.74. And our shortfall being used on this property is $14 a square foot. So we're under the reported shortfall. Non-recoverables are being reported as 2.4%. And then stabilized over 3 years of 0.9%. Our overall expenses for the property we use is 3%. Again, if you needed to compare that to any other properties, that is in here. And also included here is the Johnson report for data for the different years, different properties downtown. But you can compare that to 220 Portage to see if it's in line. I do believe that is everything I have on the property. If you have any questions, please let me know. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Spacek. Mr. Slaughter, do you have any questions?
I do. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Spacek. A very thorough, clear overview. I appreciate that. A few questions though. Did you have a chance to inspect the property in the recent?
Just go through the basement and main floor, not upstairs.
So you agree that the original age 1965 would make this the oldest of the Class B office towers in Winnipeg, correct?
Yeah, I would agree.
Okay, and the effective age is admittedly a subjective adjustment, maybe not by yourself, but by somebody in the department.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, subjective. Okay. If I could ask you to refer to your study. I just want to clarify, you mentioned that the city's market vacancy allowance for Class B was at 12%.
It is for the cycle, yes.
And does that take into account the site-specific performance or the actual market performance or a combination of both?
The model is based on, from my understanding, the market, like the overall market vacancy of OFBs. We're trying to capture, what is the market average? What is the market vacancy as that is, in our eyes, what it should be value, what the vacancy rate should be for equitable purposes.
Okay.
We don't go site specific and, unless it's a very severe case where it would be noted, you'd notice the vacancy rate being much higher, but that is, it is overall just the vacancy market vacancy shown by the market vacancy we use in the income workout.
You'd agree, though, that the exercise by the legislation for us today is to determine the market value of the subject property itself, correct?
Yeah, using the fee simple approach to value, I do understand that.
Okay, so on page 2 of the study provided, there's a summary of the vacancy across Class B at the top. I think it's the in the second section from the top, OFB Global Marketplace, it has vacancy average, vacancy weighted average, and vacancy median. And you had cited this, but if we look at the vacancy average, which is the 6th row down, and we scroll across to 2022, it's at 22.9%, which is about double of what the city is considering market. You agree?
I would agree.
Okay, and also when we look at the trajectory of the vacancy allowance, it's clear that since 2017, it's been on an upward trajectory and really spiking as we head into 2022. You agree with
Correct,
that?
yes, I agree, I would agree.
Okay, then if we turn to page 4, we have the site-specific performance of the property summarized for 220 Portage. And again, you had cited this before, but just to reiterate, if we go to the vacancy, which again is the 6th row down for 220 Portage on page 4.
Page 6, right, for the subject?
220 Portage, I think page 4.
Oh, that's funny, I have it on page, I don't know what I have. to-
Oh, I must have an older version.
Yeah,
Okay, I apologize to the
It's
panel.
page 6, I believe, for the one.
Page 6, okay. So we have 220 Portage, and if we scroll across on vacancy, we'll see that at 2022, it is at 24.7%. Is that correct?
Yes, I would agree,
Yeah, and again, that's double what the city is applying for.
absolutely.
And once again, we see that this is elevated not just in 1 year, but it's been elevated for the reported history of the property. The last question is stable. You mentioned that the stabilized in the last column is to be the average of 2020 to 22, but I think would the math not be incorrect? Should the math not be the average of the 3 vacancies being 25.1% rather than 21.3?
21.1 versus 21.3.
So you have the stable, if I can just, to make sure I don't have
Yeah,
an
no,
updated
no,
version.
it's good for me too, to make sure I don't.
Yeah.
I wanna make sure it's right.
For 220 Portage vacancy in 2020, we have 29.2%, is
Yeah.
that correct? And then we have 21.4 and 21,
I would agree, 21.4,
and then 24.7 and 22.
yes.
So would that not be an average of just over 25%?
Again, I believe you,
Yeah.
I don't know off the top of my head.
No problem. And I know this is something that was derived before, so.
Absolutely.
Not pointing fingers.
No, I did not. Spreadsheet. $25.1, I would agree, yeah, absolutely, I believe that is an error.
Thank you, Mr. Spacek. So just to reiterate then, we have a market vacancy across all Class Bs at the reference date of approximately just over 22%. We have a site-specific stabilized vacancy at 25%. But again, the department feels that 12% is the appropriate vacancy allowance.
Well, yes, absolutely, I believe the vacancy is higher in this property, and I'm not disagreeing that the vacancy is higher, but for our market approach to value using the model for income, the market average is 12, and some buildings are higher, some buildings are lower, and this is a building that's higher. I don't.
But again, with the market average according to the study is 22%, is it not?
Yeah, absolutely, but we don't just go to the average. It's, you know, again, over time, we would hope that it would go down closer to the actual market vacancy, which is across multiple properties. It would go down to, you know, 12%, 10%, whatever it may be. We don't just go to the actual yearly vacancy as shown. It's not just.
Okay.
It's not
So-
adjusted.
So just to make sure that we're clear on that, then, it's not necessarily based on the actual vacancy in the market, nor the actual performance of the property, but kind of a hopeful expectation of where things will land in the future.
Well, it can be, it's just because there are OFBs with much lower, and I know for 2022, like you said, vacancy is higher, offices struggled after COVID, vacancies are higher, but our model vacancy for 2025 is 12% for OFBs.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Spencer. You had mentioned that the shortfall on the same page for 220 Portage, the actual expenses are just over 1750, And the shortfall is quite a bit lower, that's applied at $14.
$14, yeah, per 17 approximately.
Okay, thank you. Lastly, or before we get to cap rate. So using these, what I'll call hopeful assumptions for the property, as far as vacancy allowance and shortfall and such. On page 5 of your report, and I don't think the panel needs to turn to this, but just to reiterate that the net operating income that's determined is $1,864,000 approximately.
Yes.
Okay. And on page 11 of your report, you included the reference here, or the year-end 22 income statement. And the actual income at the bottom of page 11 is significantly less than that. It's, I think, if my eyes are correct, 1,363,000. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, absolutely, I did take a look at that, but I do believe there are some expenses you would take out if we stabilized it as, like, looking at it for assessment purposes, like recoverable principal or amortization capital for the repair and maintenance. Again, brings it closer to the actual 1.8.
Okay, this is a common thing that comes up, I've heard in recent hearings, where the city prefers to not consider a recoverable expense item. And that is recoverable principal amortization. You do understand that that is an actual allowable expense. To claim that as anything other than a recoverable expense would be fraudulent, and that there is a balancing revenue item to that expense. You agree with that?
No, I agree with you. I agree that the owner will be claiming it as an expense.
Yeah.
I will truthfully did not go into the act of going through 3 years, stabilizing the income and seeing what it actually is, just looking it over. I do believe there's an argument to be made on our end that the NOI reported, just taking it as 1.3, we would argue it would be higher, but I understand your point.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Mr. Patrick. So I just have a general question then. As a potential investor for a property, if your determination of the stabilized year one income, as you've done, and you admitted it's based on kind of an optimistic expectation of what might happen in the future rather than what's happening today, and it comes out 35 or 40% higher than the actual income, how does that make you feel as an investor? Do you think you would apply more risk to that purchase if the facts are telling you that what you hope to see is not happening? Is that a riskier investment in your mind?
I think it could be argued, yeah.
Okay. Thank you. So for the capitalization rate, which is where we recognize this risk, just to come back to your evidence on page 8. So you have a summary here of the 3 major broker firms and what their marketing materials are citing as capitalization rates for Class B. And I think you mentioned it ranged from Colliers was on the low end, and then Cushman Wakefield was on the high end. But the average across the board would be about 7.5%, correct?
I think looking across the 3, you could argue the average for the 3 Colliers, CBRE, Cushman could be around, sure, around 7.5.
7.5. And you have no other evidence to support the city's application of 7%?
No, I have no actual sale capitalization rates today.
Okay. I think that is all the questions. Thank you, Mr. Patrick. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. Mr. Seelan, do you have questions for the assessor?
Yes, when it came to the rent, the $2,524,627, was this based on the 173,210 square feet? Excuse me, or was it based on the applicant's 169,700?
The model bases that on the larger square footage of 173. Yeah.
No adjustments have been made.
Not by the model, no. This is what was modeled for 2025.
Thank you. That's all my questions, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Ms. Stevens, do you have questions for the assessor?
Mr. Spacek, I know Mr. Slaughter went over this, but I just want to go back a little bit to the modeling of the cap and the modeling of the vacancy. I want to confirm, because you had mentioned earlier that the OFBs were all at 7%. Is that correct for this cycle?
Yeah, from my understanding, that's why the range is at 7%. There might be an outlier that I don't know about that's outside of that 20 and 80%, but in general, the OFBs for 2025 are modeled at 7%.
Is that, so has there been any overriding done to the modeling system for it to spit out the exact same cap rate for every building, regardless of its age or condition, or?
I believe it's a decision done in, we have a whole section in modeling that does the reassessment, and when OFBs were looked at, it was determined, just like the ranges are pretty tight for even what's reported to the third party, it was determined, from my understanding, 7%, because I don't see ones that are outside of 7%, but 7% is the general cap rate for OFBs in 2025.
Okay, so the modelers have put 7, so I know that the model normally, does it on an individual basis with each building, but every OFB, based on your modeling, the staff who are working with the model it is at 7%.
Yeah, from my understanding, 7% OFB.
With no variation, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, and again, with the 12% vacancy, would that have been an override in the model as well then?
I don't think it's ever, I don't think they're overrides. I can't answer how 12% was determined exactly for OFBs. I don't do that work, so.
Okay, because when your own study showing the vacancy to be significantly higher in these buildings, is just curious.
Yeah, absolutely. Some of them are worse than others, and then some OFBs you'll have the vacancy is lower and some are around there. And again, the average is across a lot of units in a lot of buildings downtown. So, but absolutely,
yeah, okay.
I see that the vacancy is higher in this building than the model vacancy for 2025.
Okay, that's all my questions. Thank you.
Okay, and I just wanted to pick up slightly on shortfall. The shortfall in the OFB study, the average there is very close to it's very close to the model average. So the model. So your modelers seem to be using what's coming out of that OFB study for shortfall, right? But not on the other.
Again, I can't. I don't want to answer how an area does the regression or the modeling for the shortfall. I don't from my understanding, we're not looking at 2020 portage and then adjusting each one for 2020 portage. It's the market of all the $14 is used for all OFBs. And then sometimes it's going to be right bang on, sometimes it's not, but it's not being adjusted just for 220 portage to be that number.
Okay, so just a question then on the use of this study. When you have a property that's being appealed, do you reference this study to see if the model is making sense and relative to all OFBs? Or
yeah, I do think it's a good tool to see how a building's performing to the model. Absolutely.
Okay, and have you made adjustments in? I
have not touched anything in this property. This is how the model put it out. Presenting it today, I haven't changed one number on here. This is all model.
Okay. Thank you very much for that, Mr. Spacek. I have no additional questions, so Mr. Slaughter.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have two documents I'd like to refer to. The first one is the overall evidence for 220 portage.
Okay.
And as I mentioned, Mr. Spacek did a great job of the overview, so I'm not going to go through a lot of the fine points. I'll go straight to page 6 and 7, please.
Okay.
Mr. Spacek had mentioned the location of the property and the age. It is, again, the oldest of the Class B towers. It was originally built in 1965. I think it's a great example of modernist architecture for Winnipeg. I'm quite a fan of the building, but I'm not here to talk about my opinion. I'm here to talk about value. The one thing I'd like to point out for the panel is there's typically, as Mr. Spacek said, a discrepancy in the leasable area for this building, and there's actually a reason. The leasable area of the building itself is around 169 to 170, and you have a variance sometimes depending on how units are done. But the reason why the city is a bit higher, I don't necessarily have a problem with. It's because they've included the storage, I think, on the 17th floor in their leasable area, whereas we state what the owner states is the leasable area, which is the basis of the recoverable expenses as being 169, and then we lump sum add the storage income. Our approach actually is a bit more optimistic, comes out a bit higher because you're not eroding that income by allowances, but that's why I'm not concerned about our difference, as long as we're coming to a conclusion at the end, which recognizes the revenue potential. The building is connected to the walkways, but it really is kind of on its own as far as access to parking and amenities. And it was purchased by artists for that exact reason, to be kind of coupled with the Class A tower at 360 Main. But as they are trying to separate this property off, any investor has to look at this as a standalone property, and that's how the valuation that we're coming up with today is approaching the property. And yes, like all other Class A's and top end B's in downtown Winnipeg, this property has had investments. Every property has had to, because of what I'm going to describe to you as a softening market. So it's not alone in its improvements. And secondly, they were necessary because of the age life of the property. So on page 12, I'll get right into the income approach. I'll start with this overriding statement, Madam Chair, that one of the big issues between our office and I think in the city in the last few years with the valuation of office is we don't really agree with the one size fits all approach. I mean, the legislation is clear that we're to approach this to determine market value, and that needs to look at the performance of the property, not just the overall market. So, you know, we disagree when blanket allowances are applied or blanket rates that don't recognize site-specific features. And that cuts both ways. So I'll just quickly walk through, and I know that I've been through this before, so please stop me if you don't need to hear me go through. But I do think it's an important overview, and I won't take long, about how we approach, as appraisers or valuers, the valuation of a complex property like this. So step one in the income approach is we determine the potential market rent. And the appraisal texts are clear on this item, that market rent, as defined in the real estate investment analysis textbook, is the rent that a property would most probably command in the open market given reasonable exposure. It is indicated by the rents paid as per the recently signed arm's length leases. So there's a focus right off the top to, well, look at the property. You know, don't look at other properties that are maybe different. Look to the property first and look to recent leases. The appraisal of real estate third edition has a similar definition that's on page 12, but they go in to say that you really have to also look at, if you're looking at other properties or even in the subject, you have to look at the circumstances of the leases. Like number one, is it arm's length? Because if it isn't, don't look at it. But even if it's arm's length, is it a unit that has significant landlord investment into the space, which is then amortized into the rent? You know, that is going to drastically change that rent for that unit compared to what is actually typical. So we need to consider that as well. And then we need to say, okay, we've looked at the actual rents in the property. Are they indicative of market? Do they pass the test on all the boxes of being at market? If it's not arm's length, of course, it's thrown out. If it's inflated or deflated by some circumstances, it should be questioned. And so we go through an exercise of looking at each rent and saying, is it reflective of market? And if not, why? Because you shouldn't just discount a high or low rent just because it isn't like other buildings. There may be a very good reason for it, and you as a valuer have to determine that. And then lastly, the municipal board has stated their opinion on this item, and they've been very clear that we are not just to look at market, you know, and come to an equitable conclusion. Manitoba legislation veers away from equity and says we have to look more at market value. So the board in this case said, and I'll just give context, this is for the Richardson building as a reference date of 1985. And the board said, the board notes in this case that 20 leases were executed in 1984 and 85. In the board's view, this direct evidence gives a more reliable indicator of the 1985 market rent than the Dawson report, which is a market report, of evidence of the rent paid in other office buildings. The use of these rental rates as opposed to rental rates in other office buildings overcomes the need to make adjustments for differences in location, age, amenities, etc. between the subject and comparison properties. They're stating very clearly, it's not one size fits all. It's not based on what happens in a different property with different location and factors. It's supposed to be a market value, considering site-specific factors. And that is the fee simple. So we go on, and there's some other points that allow us guidance on what to be concerned about when we look at actual rents. And one is that, remember, they're saying that we need to look at recent rents. And the reason is that markets fluctuate. And so if you look to a rent in the past, it might not be indicative of what's happening in today's market. And similarly, if we look at a rent that steps up in the reference date, that also may not be indicative of the market because the meeting of the minds took place in the past. There was an expectation by the parties of where things would go, and that might be lower than what actually turned out, or it might be higher than. So we need to be cautious, and the appraisal texts are very clear about this. A lease step up during the lease term in the majority of cases should not be considered to be at market and should not be used within a current market rent study. So I think the city's market rent study is an excellent tool. I think it allows us to really look at what's happening in the whole and at the subject property itself. I think in this particular case, it contradicts the conclusions of the city. But one of the concerns that I do have is in the market rent conclusions of the study, because it looks at, and it admits this, and the author has admitted this in questioning, it looks at renewals and step-ups. And that can potentially skew the conclusions. Historically in Winnipeg, it might not have, because historically in Winnipeg, things were fairly steady. But what we've had in the last few years is quite a rocky road. And then there's some information about tenant inducements as well. The appraisal texts are very clear that if you look at a unit that has been obviously inflated, or the rent's been inflated because of the significant work a landlord put into the space and then amortized into the rent, you need to be cautious. That might not be indicative of what you would expect for your unit without a similar investment. So that's the background on how we approach the market rent study. I then jump past and we look to the market just to get a context. What's happening in the market? And Mr. Spacek had gone through this as well, but for Class B, which is a really wide range of properties, the asking rents, not the actual, the asking rents as reported by the brokers are pretty tight in the $15 to $16 range. And what we find in a market like we have today, which I describe as a tenant's market, is that asking will outpace actual with a delta of about 10 to 20%. If you're asking 15, you'll probably get 13. You know, not exact, but something like that, unless you invest a lot of money into the space. So the Collier's Winnipeg office market report, where this number comes from, state in general terms, rental rates remain relatively flat, but lease inducements have increased, compressing net effective rents in Winnipeg CBD. So don't be fooled. It may look like rents are staying the same, but it's costing more money on the landlord's part to keep them there. And this continues to be the case in April 23, where Avis and Young says we continue to see landlords provide significant investments to attract qualified tenants to lease downtown office space. Again, this just gives a background of what's happening in the market, which is a softening market becoming what we call a tenants market. Then we look to leases in the market. We have a good advantage because we represent most of these Class B properties. And we look to not step-ups, not old leases, but recently transacted office rents. And the average of these rents for a wide range of properties is approximately $15.50. Some of these are higher floors, some are lower floors, some are connected to the walkways, some are not. And typically we find that lower floors will be on a lower range than the higher floors. Now we turn to the subject property. So first off, we look at all the rents. We analyze every rent in the property and we look to the ones that are recently transacted. And they show that there is a softening. The rents that we see recently transacted are less than the rents that the property may have attained in the past. The most recent rents are Unit 1301A and 1304, 2678 square feet, leased in late 22 for $15.50 a square foot. Hang on. 1340 though, leased for only $8 a square foot in December 22. But that was a lease that allowed 3 years at the lower rate before they stepped up to $16. And similarly, 1120 came in at $10 a square foot, right at the reference date, April 23. But that's 3 years, and then it steps up to $17. So overall, we're seeing, the market rent is probably around $15.50 for the property, or about $15 approximately. And then we turn to page 17, where we go through every single rent in the building. And we apply those, because we think they pass the test as market, we apply $15 as the market rent, and we come to a conclusion as the overall market rent for the property at the bottom of page 17 of $15.63 a square foot. We back up, we look at all of the tests that we've done. Does it mark all of the tests to be an accurate picture? It does. We've looked at market, we've looked at other properties, we've considered those rents, we looked at the subject property, analyzed each one. That is higher than what the city's applying. Significantly, it's about $1.25 higher than what the city's applied. But this is the exercise that we must do for a site-specific valuation. So if I stop there, I wouldn't be here. But it's everything that happens after that line item that brings us concern. So the next item is vacancy allowance. Now, we have a major concern here, Madam Chair. When we determine a vacancy allowance in our mind, what we're supposed to be doing is looking at a site-specific stabilized, not a year one, but a stabilized vacancy. Typically, the boards and appraisal texts look at 3 years. We sometimes stretch it to 5. And then we compare that to what's happening in the market. And the conclusion typically, not always, but typically, as an appraiser, I find, should land somewhere between the two, the stabilized actual performance and the market. You're never at zero, even for an owner-occupied property, because as Mr. Spacek said, over the life of the property, you're likely going to face vacancy. And conversely, over the life of the property, you might not always have hard times, but certainly you have to look at history to determine where things are going. And I can mention that when we look at the Winnipeg marketplace, it has been softening. And I'll talk about this a bit more in the cap rate study, but basically, if I'm to sum it up, Winnipeg downtown had what I'd like to call a renaissance from about 2009 to 17. A lot of excitement, a lot of activity, a lot of investment. It started to soften in about 2018 for the simple reason that supply started outpacing demand. By 2018, when you look at all of the tenants in the Class A and B downtown marketplace, there was nothing really net new. There was people moving, but there wasn't much coming into downtown as new. So demand started to flatten out. And then we had supply spike with the True North Tower. That was the first ripple that started to cause a disruption in the kind of upward trajectory. Then, of course, we had the pandemic. And while the pandemic didn't affect anything on paper for office, because leases typically extended past the duration of the pandemic, what it did is create a new market behavior, which is the work from home and remote work. And that continued strongly after the pandemic up to the reference date of April 23, and I won't mention what happened after. But that changed the whole fabric of downtown office, again, decreasing demand. The third thing that happened, I'll get into in the capitalization rate study, is a softening on expected rates, but I'll talk about that in a moment. So for the vacancy, because of all these factors, the softening of the downtown market, we see vacancy increasing. We saw it in this assessor study. It goes up considerably, and it's up to about 23%. The brokers on average are stating the average is around between 15 and 17%. That is because they're lower because typically they include owner-occupied properties, and I don't think the city does. But certainly, that's not 12%. There is no supporting evidence for 12% in the market. Then we look to the subject property itself. It has had a historic concern with vacancy ever since it was the mid-2000s when I think Great West Life and Royal Bank were the main occupants, and they started downsizing and moving out, and the property never recovered. And the new owners put in significant dollars to try and turn this around, to try and get the vacancy below 50%. And they managed to get it down to 27%, 21%, 21%. And in our calculations, 20%, but it's never improved. It's never improved. It's been around 20% or higher for the recent past. So we look at those two sets of data, the market in the high teens easily, and the subject property in the low 20s. 12% is not the vacancy allowance that should be applied. The municipal board has given us guidance that we can't ignore a site-specific vacancy. I include a municipal board order for a rather recent one. It was for the 2002 assessment, that was the previous one. On page 19, I'll turn to the one that I'm referring to. It was for 75 Scurfield. And I include that decision at the end. And basically, the board said at the end that the board will follow the precedent set by the board in the past, that the board cannot ignore actual vacancy rates in making evaluation of income. In that order, the board applied a 25% vacancy for a property that had a 3-year stabilized vacancy of 50%. 25% is typically the maximum. But the point is, when the site-specific vacancy is higher, stabilized, we need to consider that in addition to the market vacancy. So in conclusion, Madam Chair, all things considered, I actually think the vacancy allowance for this property should be somewhere between 18 and 20%, that range, because that's the evidence. But we have used 15%. It should be no lower than 15%, certainly. When we use 15%, though, we are going to be coming to a conclusion on income that is likely to bring concern to any investor. And this is what happens with a vacancy allowance, is that if you don't recognize the risk of what's happening in the vacancy allowance, you must recognize it in the cap rate. And some appraisers will have a trade-off between the two. So we're using 15%. We've increased the shortfall rate closer to actual. That should always happen. Not completely to actual, but something closer to. We use $16. We've accepted the city's non-recovered expenses of 3%. Again, to us, this was never really an issue of what the allowance used is. Our concern is make sure your cap rates are determined with the same methodology. And we didn't think that happened in the past. So now we are using 3% in our derivation of cap rates as well, and we use it in our methodology for the subject. The last difference in our approaches for NOI, Madam Chair, is on storage income. Again, the city's leasable area is higher than us because they include storage area. We include the storage lump sum. So if I may then please direct the panel to the second document, the capitalization rate study. This is really where the differences lie. When I go through the calculations of everything I described to you, which is a very thorough, granular look at market and site specific, our NOI isn't drastically different than the city. So it's a little lower, but not much. So the real issue here today is the cap rate. So I know that we've gone through this many times. I'm going to keep this very brief, okay? And I'll welcome any questions after. Basically, when we look at cap rate, it's looking at the expected rate of return an investor will have for an asset, much in the same way that an investor might look at a stock. And the three main factors that will influence that are, we determine what our annuity is, that's our stabilized year one income. And then we say, what do we expect to happen in the future? So if you expect that income to increase, the cap rate will come down. If we expect turbulence in the market or with the performance of the property, or if we think we maybe overshot our estimations based on what's actually happening, that will increase the cap rate. But there's another component to the cap rate, it's not the sole component, but another component we need to consider is the cost of money. Because any investor will say, well, I could buy 220 Portage and earn $1.8 million a year. Or I could buy a GIC or a government bond. If I'm buying real estate, I need a higher rate of return. It's less liquid, there's more risk. And so we have what's called a spread between a risk-free investment and what somebody would pay for real estate. So if the risk-free investment rate of return has increased, the cap rate will likely increase as well, unless everything is so rosy with that property that you overlook that. So on page 6, we give a background on what's happening to that risk-free investment rate. Between the last reference date of April 21 and April 23, a very significant thing happened. The artificially low Bank of Canada rate through the recession, which was forced down to next to nothing to get people to spend money, started to increase because the pandemic ended and everybody realized, oh, now we have inflation. And to compensate for that or to counter that, the Bank of Canada started escalating the Bank of Canada rate. You can see on the top of page 7, it started to skyrocket up to about 4.5%. So that's the overnight rate. Then the banks determine and bonds will be set based on a spread from that. And so the bond, naturally, the mortgage rate shot up as well, not to the same extent. They're not working in tandem, but they go up because the banks are spending more to borrow the money to lend to their clients. So you can see the ripple effect. Bank of Canada goes up, the mortgage rates goes up, the bond rates go up. Then we look on page 8 to the effect on cap rates, because everything I described to you is a theory. The theory is if lending rates go up, cap rates go up. On page 8, we see that spread between a risk-free 10-year government Canada bond, which has gone up. You can see that at the end of the graph on page 8, it shoots up 21 to 23. And we see cap rates starting to increase. It's not again in tandem, it's a lag effect, but they will increase. That's overall cap rates in Canada, not office in Winnipeg. Then we get a little bit more focused on our approach. We look only at office cap rates across the country, and that's on page 9. And we see, as we would expect, they're shooting up. Not just because of the cost of money increasing, but because of all the factors I described, which is not sold to Winnipeg. It's a riskier investment now. So they have gone up by approximately 100 basis points between the last reference date and this reference date across the country. And remember, Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal, Ottawa, all those locations have lower, about 200 basis point lower cap rates. So what you look at here should not be the basis of cap rates in Winnipeg. I won't go into this, but I have ample background support for all of these factors that I'm describing: the work from home, the influence of the lending rate. I should mention this one. This basically sums it up from the Collier's cap rate study in Q1 23. Cap rates in Winnipeg have begun to increase due to the rising rate environment, which is consistent with other locations across Canada. So on page 10, then we start looking at the Winnipeg office market. I won't reiterate this, Madam Chair, but ample quotes and citations from various broker reports saying that the market's softening. All of the things I mentioned: supply outpacing demand, demand being further reduced because of work from home, supply going further up. What we have in April 23 is vacancy is going up and up and up because of all these factors. And what do we have coming? The Wawanesa Tower. Who was the major tenant in Class B office besides the government? Well, besides Canada Life as well, is Wawanesa. That is going to cause another increase in vacancy imminently. How do I feel about that as an investor? I'm not feeling very good. What does that do to my cap rate? It increases it. So now we look to what the brokers are saying about capitalization rates on page 11. And Mr. Spacek had this in evidence, but let's look exactly at what they're saying. Those cap rate ranges for Class B, as mentioned, go from 6.25 to 8.5%. When you compare that to what these brokers were saying 2 years ago in the last reference date, that is between 25 to 150 basis points higher. Everybody is saying cap rates are going up. It's irrefutable. We can see on the bottom of page 11, different asset classes in Winnipeg, and that sort of teal line that shoots up from 21 to 23, that's office, Class A office. Class AA office. The Collier study on page 59 of our study, Madam Chair, they had actually issued a correction. They said we weren't paying attention when we issued that 6.25 to 7%. They said actually Class B should be 6.5 to 7.5 at the end of 22, and then in mid 23 it's going up to about 7.5 to 8.5. So they corrected themselves. Regardless, nobody is saying 7%. Basically, if you were to look at all of this and sum it up, it's 7.5 to 8% is what Class B is doing. So then we say, okay, well, what do we actually see? Now, this is where it gets tough in a market like Winnipeg. You can't look into the past because, as I described, the past is very different. So you try to look to recent transactions, and it's rather difficult. But there are a few that are very, very telling. The first is on page 12, we summarize. I'm only going to focus on the downtown ones. But the first one is I think, the best comparison. And there's on page 13, there's a photograph of this property. Very, very similar to the subject property. It's newer, it's about a decade newer. It's at 155 Carlton. It has a strong covenant of provincial tenancy, long-term tenancy. It has historically performed at about a 1% vacancy, although that started to increase at the time of sale. So what I want to bring to the board's attention is when we look at cap rates, if you can ask 5 appraisers their opinion on a cap rate, you'll probably get 6 different opinions. because everybody has a different way of looking at the calculation. And the most important thing that we try and convey is that we need to be consistent in those calculations, or else you'll have a skewed result. So when we talk about looking at rents in the property as well as the market and drawing conclusions in our valuation, we need to do that for the cap rate. When we talk about looking at actual vacancy stabilized and the market and draw a conclusion, we need to do that in the cap rate. Shortfall, same methodology. Extra income for storage or parking, same methodology. And we've done that on page 13. You can see we took a lot of care. We represent this property for both the purchaser and the vendor. And we took a lot of care to do our analysis on the NOI. The conclusion we came to is considerably higher than the actual NOI, but that's fee simple valuation. And the capitalization rate that is derived from that late 22 arm's length sale is 7.48%. And I would argue that this is overall, not in all aspects, but overall, I would consider a bit superior to the subject because it's newer and it has a stronger covenant. In all other ways, it's very similar. Similar architecture, connected to the walkways, et cetera, et cetera. Has underground parking right below it, not over the adjacent property. On page 14, these are lesser comparisons to the subject, but we have another Class B property that actually I would consider B minus. It historically has had difficulty in leasing. We've done the same analysis on the sale price in late 22, and the capitalization rate in that case is 8.7%. I wouldn't necessarily consider this a better as good a comparison. The investor in this case was very prudent. They recognized they're going to have a hard time continuing this property fully as office, and they basically cut it in half, turned one half into residential, or they're about to, and the other half is office. But it was marketed as office, and that's the cap rate. The third is right across the street from us. Again, a newer property to the subject. Although I would say it's inferior because it's not connected to the walkways and it doesn't have, well, the subject doesn't have parking either, so let's keep that aside. In this case, though, again, it was an underperforming Class B asset. We did our analysis based on the same methodology. And when we look at the sale price, which was older, it was October 19, but that was an 8.18% cap rate. The other comparisons I won't go into, they're more suburban in nature or one where you can't really determine a cap rate because there wasn't a tenant in place. So what I think we would conclude, Madam Chair, from this study, looking at what's actually happening in the market, looking at all the factors that influence cap rate, looking at what the brokers are telling us, looking at the escalation from the last reference date when the city had also used, I think, a 7% cap rate, and looking at actual sales in the market using the similar methodology. I think we have very strong evidence that 7.5% is the capitalization rate that should be applied to most Class B. You would adjust that then for site-specific factors. What are the site-specific factors for the subject? Its NOI that we're trying to estimate on fee simple is about $500,000 more than the actual. It's the oldest Class B in the city. It has historic vacancy, which they cannot seem to recover despite investment. 7.5% in my mind would be the floor. It would only go up from there for the subject property. And again, I mentioned that a lot of the risk in the vacancy, I'm pushing off to the cap rate. And yet I still apply 7.5%. So if coming back to the the main brief, Madam Chair, on page 21, we summarize our approach. I put in purple where we are actually higher than the city, and I put in blue where we're coming to a conclusion that brings a lower value. Basically, we're higher on rent, but we're higher on vacancy, we're higher on shortfall, and we're certainly higher on the cap rate. That's the most critical. And we've added other income as well. So I think that a very conservative valuation for this property in the fee simple as of April 23 is $24,456,000 rounded. In the appendix, we have photographs from my last inspection of the property earlier this year and supporting documentation, including the rent roll and income statements and the aforementioned municipal board order guiding us not to ignore site-specific vacancy. And that concludes our presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Slaughter. Mr. Spacek, do you have questions for Mr. Slaughter?
I have no questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ms. Stevens.
I have no questions, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Seelan.
Yes, have you inspected this property?
Yes, many times. The last inspection was in January of 2024.
How many square feet is the 17th floor storage?
17th floor, it's a mixture of mechanical and storage, and I think the number was, I may have it here. No, I don't have it in my evidence. I think my estimation was about 3,000 feet.
3,000?
Yeah, actually, and also, Mr. Seelan, it might have been a little less than that because I think my calculation also took into account a small room on the 5th floor, I believe it was. This building is interesting because of its age. It's like the Richardson building, where mechanical floors are on the lower level and the upper level, because in those days they couldn't have they couldn't reach the range of these stories just from having mechanical in one place, which leads to a greater erosion. This is one of the things about these older buildings that's kind of a consideration for investors.
You mentioned about walkways. Does this building just have, I'll say, underground walkways? Or does this have walkways that are above ground?
No, not above ground. It is connected to the underground walkway. It leads out through its lower level into the shops of Winnipeg Square. So I mentioned to you that the property itself doesn't have any parking on site and very few amenities. The nearest parking, which actually none of their tenants can really use anymore, would have been, you go into the shops of Winnipeg Square and then down to that parkade entrance below. Now what they're having to do is typically lease parking at a nearby above ground parkade. But its location does not have any connection above ground, only below ground.
Thank you. That's all my questions, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. I have no other questions either. Mr. Spacek, do you care for summation?
No summation, please, and thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Slaughter?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think in summary, one size fits all doesn't work for valuation in Manitoba, especially for office towers. And we need to recognize the environment that this asset is performing in when we look at the capitalization rate. I strongly suggest that 7.5% would be the floor for the capitalization rate for this property. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I guess this item is now concluded, and we've heard all items scheduled, and this hearing is now adjourned. So thank you, Mr. Spacek and Mr. Slaughter.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So I'm gonna get back to the office and follow up. I sent those emails before
Awesome.
we started.
Awesome.
Um,
Yeah, I think I'll get to those. I just have evidence due today, and then for some more big ones, and then I'll be getting to that.